9/11 changed America. Good evening, I'm Edel Howland. Welcome to Red, White and Blue. 15 years after the single deadliest attack on United States soil, the impact of the 9/11 attacks is still being felt today. In the aftermath of 9/11, the US saw policy changes, the formation of new governmental agencies, and the psyche of Americans forever changed. So tonight we ask, have policy changes helped America become safer today? How has the state of immigration evolved since 9/11? And what is the state of American civil liberties today? To walk us through the conversation, we welcome Dr. Ryan Kennedy, Associate Professor of Political Science with the University of Houston, Mustafa Tamiz, former consultant with the Department of Homeland Security under President George W. Bush, and Matthew Festa, Professor of Law with Houston College of Law. Leading our discussion, our hosts David Jones and Gary Polland.
Well, welcome. This is an auspicious anniversary, and I'm sure we all remember 9/11 and our personal experiences with it. And my comment would be is that America changed that day, and we realized that we're not as isolated from the world as we thought because of our oceans. So, the first question I want to ask you, and anyone who wants to take it can, are we safer today than we were in 9/11?
Well, yes and no. And that's a classic answer, right? But there are many things you could look at the statistics about. There hasn't been another 9/11 since. But on the other hand, terrorism has a way of shifting its targets. So you really never know until the next one. I think your point about this, the psyche of Americans is important because before 9/11 we couldn't imagine it. And since then we've done nothing but imagine it.
Your take, Mustafa?
Well, I think it's the same, but there's some things we're much better at. In terms of interagency communications, we're much better at sharing information, but it hasn't dropped down at the local level that we need to do. So there's a lot more that we can do there. And then we've not really adapted to how we deal with the internet and this evolving threat. The biggest threat we have when it comes to terrorism now is how people radicalize over the internet, and we're not nearly spending the kind of resources we need to on that vein, and that's what we really have to tackle.
So you would say that the development of the internet has some good things, it also has some bad things?
Well, not just the internet, it's just how this threat has evolved. Now there's recruiting on the internet that we're not spending the kind of resources, we're not putting the intellectual capital that's necessary to tackle it. And that's something that we have to put a special focus on in this coming decade.
Yeah, it's a constant cat and mouse between terrorists and anti-terrorists. If you have asked me in September 10th, 2001, if we were better prepared for an airplane hijacking, I would have said, of course. We had prepared very well for the hijackings of the 1970s, for the bombings of the 1980s, but we weren't ready for suicide attacks. If you ask me today, are we better prepared for the kind of attack that we saw on September 11th? Absolutely we are. But the threat continues to evolve, and we have to evolve with it.
So what helped us protect ourselves? We know the initial reaction to 9/11 was the invasion of a couple of countries. We created Guantanamo, where most of the people were swept up, and we had no idea whether they were enemies or combatants. We installed torture regimes all over the world, and of course we spied on our own people and listened in on our own conversations. So that was the initial reaction. How well did that work?
So I think there were some things in the initial reaction that worked better than others. When it came to getting down to fundamentals, things like interagency cooperation, things like improving intelligence sharing with our allies, I think those were some of the most effective steps that we took after September 11th in order to respond to the threat. The more dramatic actions, honestly, it's really difficult to tell if they had any positive effect. I think we were probably going to go into Afghanistan no matter what. After September 11th, we were going to go after al-Qaeda. The invasion of Iraq, my personal evaluation of it was that it probably, at least in terms of terrorism, probably exacerbated the issues. But the arguments at the time were for other reasons aside from just terrorism. So I think your audience is going to evaluate that on the basis of a number of criteria in addition to the effect on terrorism.
And history will evaluate that, right? But, is the region more destabilized today because of the Iraq War? The answer is yes. But I don't think that's where our focus should be. Our focus should be more forward-looking. And looking at it now, what's happening in Syria, what's happening with ISIL, it's very important to understand this current threat. What Al-Qaeda did was, Al-Qaeda's strategy was, they wanted to push out the West from the Middle East. They wanted soldiers, U.S. soldiers, European soldiers out of the Middle East. What ISIS wants is, they want U.S. soldiers, European soldiers in Middle East. So they cause terror threats in the West because they want to boots on the ground, because they want this end of term civilization war of the world. And so we need to kind of understand that. And ISIS's message is kill where you are. So preparing for that and being better at pushing back against it on the internet is critically important for our future. So I think this notion of trying to keep fighting our wars of yesterday between who was right, who was wrong, is really not where we need to be. What we need to be is forward-looking of how we deal with this threat that we have today.
Yeah, Matthew, in light of that forward-looking and the threats as they've evolved, I mean, you probably are not worried about a 9/11 attack on the United States now. You think we've got that taken care of?
And it's hard to say why that would be, whether it's the consequences of the foreign policy decisions or the internal domestic security measures we've taken. I wanted to add on to something Ryan observed as well, which is that he expected us to invade Afghanistan after 9/11, and that, I think, is why we can't know what's going forward. But what we do have is a permanent shift, in my opinion, in the way we view terrorism. I think if we're looking for some retrospective on 9/11, for the last 15 years, we've been treating terrorism as a military response rather than before 9/11. It had always been purely a law enforcement response. When the Bush administration declared 9/11 to be an armed attack, what that did was trigger the entire body of international law, the traditional law of war, which we hadn't applied to terrorism before. And however we go forward, that's going to be with us, but treating terrorism partly as a military activity.
As we sit here today, Mustafa, what do you think the biggest threat to the American people is from terror?
Well, let me pick up on this and add to
that.
Look, if we declared war on drugs in the 80s, and now we have more drugs, right? And it's been more people in jail, and it's proliferated worse, right? It's just grown. And by declaring war on terror, we're kind of doing the same thing. If we had declared war on the Medellin cartel in the 80s, we probably would have gotten rid of the Medellin cartel, right? And we would have been much better off, and probably would have had less drugs. And that's what he's talking about, that by declaring these two large wars, we've actually created this perpetual fight, rather than saying, who's the threat, how do we deal with it, and how do we move on? This is not a clash of civilization. These are basically threats that we have to do it more with law enforcement tactics, right? So if we look at ISIS recruiters like we look at sexual predators and say, sexual predators use the same tactics. They find disenfranchised people, they build a relationship on the internet, and then they try to recruit them. And that's the same thing that ISIS recruiters do, and if we try to follow the same tactics, we'll be more successful.
But the war on civilizations is euphemistic to me. It's really developed into a war against Muslim fanaticism of some sort, and as the way Mr. Trump would describe it. And it's working in other countries. The nationalist fervor is rising in other countries: France, Denmark, Austria, Great Britain, you name it. I mean, Chancellor Merkel lost her home state to nationalists. How? I guess we should ask you, Mustafa, are Muslim citizens in the United States safer today because of what is going on in the world and because of the rhetoric of presidential candidates?
Well, look, I think the biggest weapon we have that we can give Europeans is our hyphen, right? You become a Italian American, a Jewish American, a Muslim American the first day you land in the United States. That hyphen is an incredible tool to get people to be part of a nation. Europeans don't have that. You could be a fifth generation in England and you're still not a Brit, you're still an Asian. So this is an incredible thing we have of getting people to be part of our nation, and that's something that to be celebrated. And the kind of thing that you're talking about, look, I mean, when the Irish came and when the Italians came, there were these kind of will they ever assimilate? Will they be part of it? They're Catholics. Will they? Who are they? Who are their allegiance to. All of that is history now, and that'll be the same way for many other ethnicities. So we've got to think about our history, how we've evolved and how we've grown as a nation, and celebrate that and celebrate our diversity.
I want to pick up on something that Mustafa said earlier. It's really, really important that we put the terrorist threat in some kind of perspective. We tend to build our enemies up to be 10 feet high and invincible. Every year we have about 10,000 gun deaths in the United States. A minuscule amount of that is due to terrorism. According to some counts, in 2015, we had 370 mass shootings. Of those, 2 of them were due to terrorism. If you look at the statistics on the number of people who die getting on the roadways in Houston alone, terrorism is important, but we have to make sure to put that in the perspective of other threats. Long after ISIL is in the dustbin of history, the United States will still be here, and it's important that we always keep that in mind.
Ryan, the head of Homeland Security addressed the Islamic Society Convention, the first ever that an American official addressed that group, and he said what we are seeing is the normalization of bigotry. Do you agree?
Unfortunately, I do agree. I think that we have seen a lot of rhetoric that in the past we would have thought to be unusual or unacceptable just kind of become acceptable because it's been lumped in with so much else that we would have considered unacceptable. The way I use the Jeb Bush test, would Jeb Bush have felt comfortable saying this? And if the answer is no, then chances are it's a little bit beyond the pale.
So now Jeb Bush is the arbitrator of what's on. Look.
Well,
I mean,
or if his political career would have taken a nosedive for saying it, then
and
that's
you're in the academic area. Maybe you have to be politically correct. I mean, and I will say that I have my issues with Donald Trump, and one of the things he has done that's a service to this country is to call out the political correct mentality that has destroyed the ability to have debates on issues and not be labeling people and looking at you because of that. That's just my editorial comment. But I wanted to talk about immigration, okay? And when David talks about Merkel being in trouble, Merkel's in trouble because the German people don't want 1 million Muslims coming from the Middle East into their country. That's the bottom line. And she just made the decision she was going to do that on her own, and she didn't have the political support to do that. Can you imagine what would happen here if that happened? Hillary Clinton is already out there campaigning. She wants to bring in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of Syrians who, and my take is, are not getting vetted at all because there's no records.
We're waiting for a source on that.
Yes, that's her campaign, David. But they don't want to check who's coming in. And when we bring these people in, isn't it true, Mustafa, and we don't know who we're bringing in, we could be bringing trouble into the country.
Well, look, I mean, I think when the American people think of refugees coming to the United States, the visuals that they have in mind are what they see on television and what the migration that's happening in Europe, and that's really not the vetting process, right? The vetting process is, on the average, it takes 2 years for somebody to vet it through. 9 agencies meet on a weekly basis to go through someone's record. Not only they go through a series of interviews, but they go through biometrics. It's a very long, tedious process for somebody to come in as a refugee into the United States, and we only take a very tiny number of people that come in. So I think it's a lot safer.
That's legal. Those are the legal entries, and then we have the massive illegal entries that are coming into the country too. That's a different issue.
We can argue back and forth about immigration on this, but if we want to talk about national security, the threat isn't people coming across the border. National security experts will tell you the threat is radicalization that happens over the internet. So if people want to make the country safe, rhetoric that makes people, that isolates individuals, that demonizes folks has more impact on it than anything else. And kind of what we were talking about, words matter in today's information society.
I have a question for you. And we had this in the discussion in the green room about David's concern about Muslims being treated badly in America. Compare the way Muslims are treated here with how they're treated in Europe or how they're treated in the Middle East by fellow Muslims. I mean, this place is revelation compared to that.
Look, I don't want to talk on behalf of 1.6 billion people, right? But I think that there is a history of discrimination that occurred not just for Muslims but every ethnic group that has came. Like, so, for example, we were just talking about refugees. During post-World War II, there were Jews that were coming into our nation, and many people said, "Don't have them in here." And many supported and said to come. We look back at people that were exclusionary. We look back at people like Joe McCarthy, not as patriot, but people that were antithesis to American values. And that's what we have to remember. We are about a nation. We're a nation of immigrants that's built in religious freedom. That's who we are. We shouldn't make terrorists change our values. And if we do that, then they win.
In the Gallup poll, Ryan, immigration is at 8% of the interest of the American people. The immigration problems. They are, of course, being popularized by other people as being more significant. Let's talk about the Texas strategy for controlling our borders, where Gary says the dangers are coming from of Muslim terrorism. DPS now wants another $300 million. It'll be a $1 billion budget. They want 250 more troops. They want 5,000 cameras, 4 airplanes, 2 helicopters, and the local authorities are saying it's a waste of money. What about this Texas strategy?
I think the strategy of trying to head off people at the border has one significant problem, and that's that most illegal immigrants simply come over here on some kind of tourist or student visa and overstay. They literally fly over the border. So no matter how many people you put on the southern border, no matter how big you build the wall, there are still going to be, if people want to come here illegally, it's going to be very difficult to stop them from doing it using that strategy, which, by the way, is also one of the issues with the extreme vetting of refugees and some of these other strategies, which is that if you have a terrorist who has half a brain, they're just going to use a tourist visa, which is far easier to go through the process and to get than going through the 9 agencies and the 2-year process that's involved with refugee status.
Or swimming the Rio Grande.
Well, no, you can walk it. But a follow-up to what you said, sir. If that, and indeed, it's the border is like a virtual border. It's borders wherever it is. So if that is the problem, and I think you're right that more people come in that way, then what have we done since 9/11 to shut that border down so we actually know who's here and make sure people don't overstay their visas, and when their visas are up, you leave. That's what happens when you're in other countries.
Well, I'll tell you, it's much harder to get a medical visa into the United States. That's affected our medical center tremendously.
Yeah, that's a negative. Because people want to spend money here.
It's a huge negative. I mean, like we have one of the largest medical centers in the world, and our economy has suffered because of the process that we've created. So these things are not just one way. When you create this type of rhetoric and when you create these kind of policies that make it difficult, it affects our economy.
No, we have a system that's not enforced anyway, and it's not workable. Surely, with all the technology we've developed in the private sector, we can figure out who's here on a visa and when their time is to go. Am I missing something here?
Well, yeah,
Matthew?
And another way that 9/11 changed the way we look at the law and policy is the Patriot Act gave more discretion to consular officials to sort of make determinations about whether somebody might be related to terrorism or might have done something. And some people feel that that's overbroad. So it's difficult to strike that balance at home, overseas, in trying to get the right balance of security and a policy that kind of promotes liberty, which I think, and all these conversations we're having about immigration and domestic safety and war in the current election campaign just show you how profoundly 9/11 has changed the way we look at balancing liberty and security, and it's this constant struggle that's going to stay with us.
Let me go to another area, waste. Mustafa, you were working for Bush, so you guys know, the money was wasted by both administrations since 9/11. The estimate, according to Stephen Brill in his article in The Atlantic that David has over here, is 100 to 150 billion in failed or unworthy homeland security projects or equipment. Okay, so is this just another example of the big government wastes money and that's the way it is, and deal with it? Because they did spend trillions, so
Absolutely. And at one point, I think the Iraq War was costing $1 billion a day.
Right.
And at the time, when we invaded Iraq, there was this huge consensus among the American people that that's what we got to do. That's worth it, because the balance had been tipped towards security and that fear. So even the Bush administration just pulled the chain and money went all over the place, right? And it's when you engage in more robust government responses to anything, a lot of cash is going to go with it.
Well, Mustafa, you were in the administration. Was it preventable wasting 150 billion on fiascos for Homeland Security?
Homeland Security, 22 federal agencies were brought into under one umbrella, and yes, you're going to have waste, you're going to have all sorts of stuff. I think, and then we entered into two wars against two different countries. I think fundamentally the biggest issue was that we did all of that, yet we all continued to do tax cuts. We didn't ask American people to sacrifice. You can't go into war without asking the American people to have some skin in the game at the same time. And that's something that we've never done. When we were in World War II, American people were engaged in those wars, right? So that is, I think, and that's what we were talking about earlier, that war is a decision that you should make with a lot more thought, and the Congress should vote on it, and we should all sacrifice together to be there if you want to do this.
Well, when you speak of sacrifice, it's notable that the size of the military didn't increase while we fought two wars and sent hundreds of thousands of service members overseas, and it's
over and over again.
It's another, it's the patriotic fervor that came after 9/11 was a very salutary thing. But I think your point is spot on, that it shows there's a gap between civil society and the military, since we have a permanent volunteer military.
So we have two of these huge strategies that are being suggested by Donald Trump, and one of them is, I don't know whether he's modified it, because he's modified everything that he's ever said, but
that's not true.
One of them, he's changed his mind several times about many things. One of them has to do with total ban on Muslim migration, and the other has to do with adding another $90 billion to our defense budget, where he says we'll pay for it by ending the sequester, which somebody please tell me how that's going to happen. So 90,000 more troops, a lot of more planes, a lot of more ships. What are we going to do with them other than, he's going to be another Putin by circling the globe with more battleships. What's his strategy?
Where to start?
We can't speak for Donald Trump. I don't think anybody can. Look, at the end of the day, we do have to change the way we deploy our military, how we arm our military, and what is the makeup of our military. It's hard to do because there's so many special interests that are involved in the military. So when we start to say we don't need this many planes, someone says, well, we built those planes and we can't give that up, right? And that's the challenge that we face. Our political process is not working anymore, and therefore these big important decisions we can't seem to make.
So you were in the military, were you not?
Yes.
Yeah. So we have these two views of the military. One of them is that it's the best in the world, and that even at the leadership at the top, best in the world, best informed military leadership that we've had in the history of the United States. Another view is that they've been reduced to rubble. We need to completely rebuild it because they're nothing anymore. They win nothing anymore.
Well, those are two separate questions, what their capabilities are versus attaining strategic objectives. And I think most people would agree that the United States military is the most capable military force in the history of the world. But the question is, if post 9/11 paradigm is going to be constant armed conflict, since we've transformed terrorism into this military paradigm, and we're fighting against enemies that don't fight the same way, non-state actors, non-traditional, you might call it asymmetric warfare, that's difficult to achieve the kind of satisfying strategic objectives that, say, the surrender in World War II. And at the same time, there is an argument, I think, and some would say that the budgetary posture and the two wars have taken a toll on readiness and on the military's ability to respond quickly.
How about micromanagement by the politicians? And we're running out of time, but Iranian military harassment of our ships in international waters, and our reaction is to blow a horn. What do you think that does in terms of strategic projecting of our force? Well, we only got 30 seconds.
What about apologizing,
apologizing
to the Laotians because we dropped more bombs on them than anywhere?
Yeah, well, I have no problem with that. At any rate, you watch it. That's where the problem's going to be. The Iran situation and our weakness in the face of their provocation.
So is it going to be over with in a long time or in 30 days? Just give me one quick answer, yes or no. 30 days or a long term? Terrorism.
Look, we're in this for the long haul, but we've got to do better in terms of coming together as a country and focusing where the problem is.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, guys.
Dr. Kennedy, Mustafa, Matthew, Adele, fascinating.
Yes, absolutely. And remember, you can actually catch Red, White and Blue every Friday at 7:30 p.m. here on TV8 and again Saturdays at 6:30 p.m. We also invite you to visit us online and send us your comments. We want to hear what you have to say about the issues that affect Houston. You can submit your comments at houstonpublicmedia.org or on Facebook. And don't forget to like us. Thanks so much for watching and good night.